with democracy and freedom if they would actually, go through everything that he was proposing, which wasn't totally the case. But in other words, there are revolutions and revolutions, and there are hierarchies and hierarchies. And there are hierarchies which are going to tend to get more and more dense and not let anybody out until finally you reach what's called the paradox of repression, where they lean on people a little bit too hard and they have to fight back. And there are hierarchies which are kind of spontaneously self-organizing and spontaneously disorganizing when they're no longer needed. After all is said and done, if everybody liked obedience and following hierarchies, they wouldn't come to Berkeley, right? You wouldn't be here if that was the kind of world that you were looking at. So I guess part of what I'm saying is something very unpopular, which is that I don't think we can totally dispense with hierarchies. I'm not a complete anarchist in that regard, which is a disgrace because Emma Goldman is actually a relative of mine by marriage, so I'm disgracing the whole family when I say this, but I'm not totally an anarchist. But I'm saying that there is a place for positive hierarchies. And if we had some positive hierarchies going on, then that very tendency which people have in them that you're referring to could be used in such a way that we could create truly democratic structures, truly viable cultures, and truly healthy, empowered, diverse individuals. Okay? And I also have to say what we're going to be discovering very shortly in this course, while it's true that people have a very disconcerting tendency to fall in line with hierarchies, that they also have a tendency, something inside them that says, I want to get the hell out of here. And when you show them a way out, it's amazing how quickly you can precipitate a revolution. Someone will go right back into the next available hierarchy, which is why you need a completely nonviolent revolution. My mentor when I was doing classics and comparative literature was Alain Renoir, and his father was Jean Renoir, the great filmmaker. And so Alain, when he was a young boy, was hanging out on the set of the film Grand Illusions. And so this was a World War I movie, and a cast of thousands, and whether you were a German soldier or a French soldier, whether you got a captain's uniform or a private's uniform, depended on how big you were and what time you got to the desk when they were handing out uniforms. So it was totally arbitrary, whether you're private, lieutenant, corporal, what have you. Okay, but within 1 week, Alain noticed, this is why I love the guy, this is why he was my mentor. Within 1 week, he noticed that during the lunch breaks on the set, all the officers, the people wearing officers' uniform, they would congregate over on one side, and all the enlisted men would congregate over on another side. And if one of the enlisted men made the mistake of walking past the officers, they would hand him some money and say, apporte-moi un carafe rouge, give him a 10-franc note and tell him to go buy wine for him and stuff like that. And they would do it. It took 1 week of wearing uniforms for people to spread themselves out on priorities. So I agree that we have this tendency, but A, I don't think it's the only tendency we have. After all, Alain Renoir was not wearing one of those uniforms. And B, it's not necessarily fatal, because we can create ones that are organic, that draw upon innate structures that are more like biological, self-organizing systems, is what we're trying to get at today in this field, and that will not impede human development, will not impede, the individual will not have to sacrifice anything of importance to him or herself for the good of the whole. So that's where Gandhi derived this model of oceanic circles. I should have mentioned that actually. If this is what it looked like when you had an emergency, when you did not have an emergency, you had this series of concentric circles. This was his idea, where he said the individual serves the family serves the village serves the district serves the state serves the nation, and the nation serves the world. So you have a structure, if you will, that's larger than the individual, but does not impose power on the individual. It's not a domination structure. And at one point he went even further and said you have an individual willing to perish for the family, a family willing to perish for the village, and so on and so forth, if it gets that far. Okay, so other questions before I move on? Okay, good, because we're running out of time anyway. I want to start thinking now a little bit about insurrections, and the first example that we're going to look at in a couple of moments was a set of insurrectionary movements, but don't get confused. We're going to go back and do some history of radical pacifism in the US before we get to study insurrectionary movements per se, which will be a week from now, so don't let this confuse you. But if you take this list of the characteristics that you need to have a nonviolent episode or campaign or what have you, and you ask yourself a slightly different situation. What if you're in a situation of oppression and you need to fight back against it and you need to do it now? Because there's an opportunity, and if you don't take this opportunity, more lives will be lost and the thing will close down again. And you haven't got a Mahatma around, for one thing. You put out an ad, you post an ad on your blog and say, is there a Mahatma out there? We need to have a nonviolent revolution now. Nobody answers you, or rather hundreds of phonies answer you. You know perfectly well that's what would happen. So you don't have that kind of leadership. You have ordinary people to deal with. They have the problem in them that Yelena was talking about. What are you going to do? I think there are 3 basic ingredients with which you can launch a successful insurrection that can capture enough nonviolent energy that will work, quote unquote, or stand a good chance of work, quote unquote, and will also do good work in the sense that it will bring the history of nonviolence forward. And those 3 characteristics are, and again, this is not, these are in hyperspace. These are not in bronze somewhere on a rock, somewhere on the campus. So if you think maybe there should be 4 of them or there should be different ones, we can certainly discuss this. But at the moment, I think there are only 3 ingredients that you need. You need a just cause. You need enough courage to break out of the spell that's created by the system. And this is very much a tipping point thing. And week after next, we'll be seeing films where this is exactly what happened in 5 regimes. You have people suffering from a lot of oppression. 1 or 2 tipping point individuals step forward and say, hell, I don't care what you do to me, I'm not afraid. And suddenly the whole thing starts to break up. The whole domination system starts to break up. And then you need only one other thing, and that's number 4, that to some degree you have a sense that it's not about hating people, it's about fixing the problem. And you may even have a sense, and not fooling yourself, you really believe that it's better for the oppressors to stop oppressing you. One of my favorite hadith or traditional stories that's told about the Prophet is that he said to his followers one day, you must help everyone. And one of them said, you don't mean that. We help brothers, but we do not help oppressors, right? And the Prophet, may peace be upon him, said, no, I really meant it. You must help everyone. And the person says, how do I help an oppressor? And the epic answer was, by preventing him from oppressing. So if you can reach at least some part of that attitude in an honest way, then I think you have the basic ingredients for a successful nonviolent insurrection. The rest is strategy. And that is actually a critical element, because people often do this, but they have no idea what to do with it. This might be an example. It's a very important episode anyway. It's in my book, the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration, 1943 in Berlin. Jews who had been married to non-Jewish wives were arrested, and they were about to be deported when their wives showed up at the detention center as a spontaneous demonstration saying, "We want our men back." The Gestapo came out and said, "This is an illegal demonstration. You go back to your homes." And the women refused to go away. By the end of the weekend, there were 6,000 women there, and 2 days later, the Gestapo relented, and several thousand men were released. So it was definitely a just cause. Those women had to overcome an incredible amount of fear. It's just unimaginable to me how they were able to do that. And I don't think that they hated the regime so much as they wanted their husbands back. So there was probably some degree of this. They were good Germans to some extent. They actually probably believed that Germany had been victimized and that this is the way the country was going to rescue itself to some degree. But when that was over, they couldn't do anything further with it. It was not, clearly if you knew how to read the dynamic of what happened there, you'd say, my God, they could have brought down the whole Nazi regime if they had just kept the organization together, gone on, used the next appropriate strategies, and so forth. But they knew nothing. They didn't know what to do. There were no nonviolence courses available at the University of Berlin in 1943. Trust me. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at quite soon is a new dimension that has come into the history of nonviolence, and that is a learning process. Probably for centuries, it has been the case that any kind of learning that took place from one movement to the next was basically spontaneous. No one had any way of organizing it, which is fine up to a point. But there's a point beyond which, if you can systematize your knowledge and transmit it to other people, it becomes much more effective. Welcome to PAX 164B. That's exactly what we're doing here. But what's happening in the world is people are beginning to realize this. And one famous example that we'll be looking at quite soon, when we get into insurrectionary mode, I like that, we get into insurrectionary mode, not against me, you understand, but is the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade in 2000. That was not only supported by American agencies that had enough money to translate Gene Sharp's works on nonviolence into Serbo-Croatian, but the students who basically organized that very successful insurrection were then themselves organized into a group called CANVAS, which I think stands for Committee versus Nonviolent Action, something, I forget exactly what it stands for, who go around the world telling people how they did it. And they have incredible bona fides because they did it. They threw a very violent dictator out of power in basically one day once they got it moving. We're going to see a movie about that and talk about the pluses and the minuses of that. But the only point that I want to emphasize here is things like this have been happening since at least New Testament times. We talked about a few examples that took place in ancient Israel last semester, but nobody has systematically come along and said, what did those people do? How did it work? And how could we make it work better? And could I use that in my country? And this is the positive part of globalization, right? This is globalization from below. Globalization from above is how do we clamp down with these domination structures so that nobody can wriggle out. Globalization from below is how do people self-organize and mobilize energies in themselves that will enable them to be fulfilled and without getting into chaos. Okay, so for our last thing I want to talk over with you is this episode that I want to use as a case study that starts on page 31 of your reader. And all it is the preface to a book by Patricia Parkman called Nonviolent Revolution in El Salvador. And I know you don't have your readers with you, so let me just read parts of it to you and comment on them. I'm going to master this eraser by the end of the semester. Okay, here's where all of this study and information comes from. There was a nonviolent scholar by the name of Gene Sharp who had a kind of non-teaching position at Harvard, and he started two organizations, Center for the Study of Nonviolent Sanctions in Conflict and Defense. That's not a very 21st century kind of title. And the other one was called the Einstein Institution. And what he did, he was the first to start collecting systematically documented evidence about these nonviolent episodes that had happened. One of his students was Patricia Parkman, who was an expert on Central America. And so because of her and because of this book, people now know that, as she says, in the first week of May 1944, so this is a grim time to start thinking about nonviolent revolution and overthrowing dictators, right? It looked like dictators were bestriding the world. The people of El Salvador's capital city silently demanded the resignation of dictator Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez by staying home from work. On May 9th, a little more than 2 months after the inauguration of his fourth term, President Martinez stepped down. So this is incredible. In less than 2 weeks, people caused the downfall of a dictator. It was on his way out of the country. Not only that, his downfall set off a chain reaction in Central America. And she goes on to discuss Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Two of them were spectacular successes. One of them, namely Nicaragua, switched over from a nonviolent uprising of at least the type we're talking about here, as we all know very well, into the revolution, the Sandinista revolution. I have just spent a couple of weeks in Leon, Nicaragua, and Leon was a battleground in the city. That poor country doesn't have enough money to do anything, and you still walk around and you still see buildings today which have bullet holes in them. Because it was a Sandinista stronghold, and there were pitched battles between the civil guards and the Sandinistas. So that was a revolution that worked. In fact, this is a case in point that I wasn't even thinking of. It worked, but it did not do very good work in the sense that today Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. Contrast, if you will, one of the set of four, the Gang of Four, Costa Rica, where they started with a traditional sort of militant uprising, with people running out into the streets with handguns, and turned that around when pitched battles between anti-government demonstrators and police erupted in Costa Rica. Opposition leaders once again drew on the Salvadoran model in calling for a national strike to protest the actions of government forces, and they eventually had a nonviolent social revolution. And the first president in 1947 who came in, when they crafted the Costa Rican Constitution, as you probably are aware, they decided not to have an army. So Costa Rica does not have an army at this point. It has heavily armed police. But there are only 12 countries in the world, I believe, that do not have armies, and 10 of them have security arrangements with some other country. So there is no Liechtensteinian army. But if someone tries to attack Liechtenstein, Austria or France or somebody is going to come in and defend them. But Costa Rica has no armed forces, and it is the only social revolution which for some reason was ignored by the United States, and I don't know why it was ignored. And the result of that is that outside of the Northern Hemisphere, it's the wealthiest country in the Western Hemisphere, whereas we all know what happened to Nicaragua. But what I'm proposing is that that was partly because Nicaragua decided to go on a violent path. I'm not blaming them, but I'm just saying this is the result. So let me pull out a few of the key points here that she says silently and staying home. When you've been studying nonviolence for a while, you pick up on terms like this and you realize that what she's talking about is strategic nonviolence. In other words, it's the withdrawal of consent, period. Now, there's nothing wrong with withdrawing consent from an illegitimate regime. You could call that a form of nonviolence, but if you want to get from there to full nonviolence, you have to start bringing in positive forces, right? You cannot build an entire world order on a vacuum. You can't write a constitution in which you say the people of the United States of America forever withdraw their consent from the government, period, end of quote. I find in some ways that's kind of attractive, but I don't think you could actually get the milk delivered and things like that. Yesterday, up where I live, there's a power line blew down. I was 15 minutes late for a retreat where I was supposed to be at it. I was very glad that we had some structures in society, namely the fire department and police and things like that. They could come and fix it so I could get home after the retreat. It was very convenient. But I want to emphasize that all you're talking about here, keep this in mind because we're going to be seeing this all semester, all we're talking about here is a small piece of nonviolence. It's just a little bit of what nonviolence was capable of. So 1944, I was 7 years old. Nonviolence, Pax 164 was not on the books yet. Nobody knew what they were doing. All they knew was to withdraw consent from something that they don't like rather than to give consent to something that they do like, which would be healthy and viable. So it's way, way less than half of nonviolence. It's a tiny little piece of it. And yet in 1 week, Hernandez is out of power, and in a few weeks after that, there's a chain reaction that's spreading throughout Central America. Okay, well, I think I will stop here for now. Do read this little section, pages 32 to 33, and we'll discuss a couple more details when we get started again on Tuesday. Have a good nonviolent weekend. Thank you, thank you. Hi. Yeah. Well, can you make it 12 to 1, or do you have a class there? Yeah.